Alice, thank you very much for taking the time to talk to us about the presentation you just provided at the Women at the Top conference. I wondered if you could just take a few minutes to give us a synopsis of your background, where you're working and the type of area that you've been researching.
Certainly. I'm a social psychologist with a long career. So I've worked on gender issues rather broadly since the 1970s. The feminist movement was an inspiration for me in terms of that work, because it seemed that so many questions were being asked that psychologists should be able to answer that we couldn't answer. So other people were answering them, but without any kind of empirical backing or base, and so it seemed just a set of questions that were so exciting, and so I started with a few of them, and then one thing built on another. In terms of working on leadership and gender, I did that after studying many other aspects of gender, but it seemed in a way the most essential question in terms of equality issues, with the thought being that we won't have gender equality until there's equal power between men and women. And so who has power? Well, leaders have a lot more power than other people, right? So they have more power to determine what happens in their organizations and politics, etc. So that lack of women in leadership roles at the higher levels struck me as something that we definitely should address, and that social psychology would have part of the answer, others would have other parts, but it seemed to come late for feminists. And one reason was that in the first phase, feminists wanted to study women. So if you want to study women, you wouldn't be studying leaders very often.
Because they weren't there.
They weren't there.
Yes.
Exactly. So we've sort of come around to it later and realizing the importance of it.
Excellent. So your main research focus now is that women in leadership? Is that the area
it's one
that
of the
you're focusing on?
main areas. I'm also studying gender stereotypes in terms of doing a meta-analysis with, there are hundreds of studies to try to see if they've changed over time and what the contours are more deeply than we have. So that it relates to the leadership, but somewhat tangential.
Is that general female and male stereotypes,
right,
or work-based stereotypes?
No, the general stereotype, which should be affected by where we observe women and men, and now over time we observe them much more in the workplace. So it's really the influence of that on the general stereotype. Then I also study the more broader issue of the ultimate origins of sex differences and similarity. They have the nature-nurture type of issues, because they are very important, very contentious within psychology. So I'm a player in these debates about the origins of sex differences and similarities.
Particularly because that research crosses very many disciplines.
It does, right? Biology, anthropology, to say the least, and others. So it's very interdisciplinary, and that's very exciting. I like that, to learn what the anthropologists and the biologists and the neuroscientists are finding out.
To psychology as well.
Yeah.
That's really fascinating. And today's topic, you've focused very much on thinking about women and stereotypes and prejudices within the workplace.
Right.
And I wondered if you could just give us a short synopsis about the talk that you've just done on navigating the labyrinth, please.
Right. The point I made is that stereotypes are still part of the problem. They are alive and well, these stereotypes about women, men, and leaders. And they do create challenges for women. The idea is that we have culturally is that men are more competitive and assertive and tough, and women are nice and kinder. And those stereotypes have some reality underlying them. And so leaders need to be people who take charge and have this toughness. They should have some social skills too, but that's not the main thing we think about. We think about leaders. So what we have culturally is a relative match between the way we think about men and the way we think about leaders. So we don't worry about whether the man can be competitive and tough. We kind of figure he can. But in women, there's that question because of the stereotype about feminine niceness, which is a good thing, right? It's a good human quality to treat people well and to be nice, but we expect leaders to have that plus, this toughness. So the question in people's minds is often about women, well, she's really nice and we like her, but could she be tough enough? Could she be competitive enough in this competitive environment or whatever that people think is out there to take on that kind of responsibility? So women have to kind of overcome those doubts in a way that men do not have to overcome them.
And then do people question whether men can be nice, or is that not important because the assumption is there that they can be tough, and whether they're nice or not is not so important?
In most data, what you said, the latter point is what you get out of the data, that it's nice when they're nice, but they get away with being not nice.
Right.
So when they're kind of not very socially sensitive and maybe harsh in many ways, they can often sort of, people don't like it, but they let them do it, so to speak. And when women move into that repertoire, women are in trouble often with people because they get a lot of backlash for not having that more considerate side.
And the source of that backlash, is it direct reports, their peer group, or their managers?
It's everywhere.
It is.
Yes, it's everywhere. Their subordinates don't like it. Nobody likes it because that expectation that women will be kind and considerate. So leadership sometimes does, call for some harshness in a crisis or whatever, and so that's when women, women are good leaders, have that side, but it does often come with a negative reaction. Who's she to treat us like that? Well, a man could get away with it, so to speak, without the same reaction. That makes leadership more complex for women.
Yes. In your talk, you talked about the fact that they're shifting gradually, the stereotypes, and that the gap is narrowing.
Right.
Could you tell us a little bit more about that, please?
We do find in studying the leader stereotype over time, we have data going back to the early 70s, several ways of looking at the data. We find this gravitation in the leader stereotype in that culturally we now expect more social skills, more ability to deal with people in complex ways, other than just telling them what to do.
Yeah.
We now realize that leadership entails this, so it's moving toward androgyny. It's not moving over to the feminine side, nor has it reached androgyny, because it's still that the sort of masculine side is the more powerful theme in the stereotype. But this other theme is rising, as we would expect, because the organizational leadership has become more complex in these large organizations that are very interdependent and global. And you can't just, even if you are at the top of an organization, just make things happen by ordering them to happen. It's not like that. It takes much more negotiation. You're much more restrained in various ways. So the idea that you would need to be more androgynous in a sense is apparent logically if you think about the job, but we do in fact see that gravitation, slow gravitation in the leader stereotype, and that is a good thing for women because becoming androgynous is easier for women than taking on just a masculine repertoire, which many women find uncomfortable.
Is that helping to reduce the incongruity that you talked about between people's stereotypes of women and stereotypes of leadership?
Yes, indeed, it has reduced. It's still there, but it's there in a milder form. Okay. In many kinds of data. So it goes along with women, in fact, getting more access to leadership. That it may be part of reaction to that, but it's a reaction to the nature of the modern organization. So there is less problem than there used to be. We have to realize that, but we also have to realize it's not that there's no problem for women in this domain. There still is.
Does it result in women who tend to have the tougher attributes? Are they more likely to do well in organisations than women that have a balance of the tough side and the nice side, or a predominantly more benevolent, compassionate, universalistic side? Does it
Right.
influence the type of women who are more successful in organisations?
I think it does. I think that I think that the studies suggest that the androgyny does well for women, because if they can have both the toughness and the assertiveness, and still retain, in a sense, the softer, good human relationships consideration side, that they tend to be more successful. So, some women complain. They say, "Well, I don't want that kind of job because I have to be just like a man, and I don't want to be like that." And I think they got it wrong. That's they, in fact, would get into more trouble and be less successful if they were in that repertoire. Few women do it that way. It's not unknown. We've seen that, I think, just in examples, but more likely the descriptions you get out of women who are successful in these contexts are quite androgynous.
Yes.
That, they tend to have both sides, and I think it's a sure route to rising. For some women, that does involve learning the assertive repertoire and adding that to the kindness and consideration and good human relationships, because that's definitely still part of leadership. But I think that's quite doable to move to androgyny, to not give up your feminine side, but add this toughness and assertiveness.
There was some interesting complexities that obviously emerged from your talk. I mean, that was one of them in terms of how women balance those two sides of their leadership. You also talked about the fact that within genders there's quite a large degree of variation.
Right.
I wonder if you could explain a little bit more about that, please.
Right. I mean, sometimes people get excited about sex differences, which exist. And we do see them in leadership style, that women have a bit more of the transformational leadership, which does involve consideration but some charisma and sort of teaching, mentoring style. And women, we could say, well, women are more transformational. Isn't that wonderful? Yes, because it is an effective style. But it's a small difference in the data, which means it's only on the average. So if you had a group of men and a group of women, you could see the difference.
Yes.
If you averaged, but within, there would be men who were that way and women who aren't that way. We have to realize that in dealing with people, we have to size them up as individuals. But we tend to carry this, our first guess is often the stereotype.
Yes.
And those differences are represented in people's beliefs. But then we have to quickly individuate when we deal with people within organizations and realize the stereotypes do not necessarily carry to the individual.
Yeah. I found
very
that very
important.
yes, and
Yeah,
it's a
very
very
important.
interesting aspect.
Yeah.
And the other one that added even further complexity, you talked about the fact that the context of the organisation,
Right.
the type of organisation actually
Right.
plays into this as well.
It really does. And so organizations, in a sense, can be more culturally masculine to more feminine. So the extreme on the masculine side is often, in many countries, the military, because they have a very masculine warrior tradition, so the values are very masculine. So that's a tough environment for women to rise in. And then on the other side, you would have social services and education kinds of environments, particularly education of young children, which are culturally rather feminine, because these are serving people. And so we do find that women, in a sense, do better or even look better than men in the effectiveness data in those more feminine environments, but we get over to the more masculine environments. That they're tougher for women, so in the data they don't look quite as good as the men. So the context can be very different, and some are extremely still very difficult for women, because of the masculinity of the behavioral expectations, the values. And, I really admire women who take that on, in a sense, and can handle it and still do well. There certainly are women who do.
Thank you for that, because there are obviously lots of interesting different variables that are at play here.
Absolutely, we mustn't oversimplify.
Yeah, and I wish I had more time to ask you more questions on that, but what I'd like to go on to now, given the presentation that you've just given, is to think whether there are some key take-home messages for different groups of people who might be listening to this podcast. So if we could start off thinking about whether or not there are any key messages that you have for people within organisations who are responsible for female careers. So people who, for example, work in human resources, or senior managers who might be involved in the progression and development of women up through the organisation. Are there any key messages from your research for that group of people?
Yes. One of them is that prejudice and discrimination are still present in our organizations, even though we individually usually don't intend to discriminate or even realize that we are, because it is this sort of assumptions we make, stereotypic assumptions about men and women, about other kinds of groups, that we carry with us, and they're below the surface. We show in social psychology that we're not sort of conscious of them, and so one's own perceptions are that I'm just choosing the best person here. But we carry with it the cultural stereotyping, which makes women sort of less fitting, for leadership stereotypically. So to the extent that is there, we don't necessarily understand its power over our thinking. And so the message is, to individuate and to get by that, and not to blame people, to say, oh, you stereotype, you're like, what are you doing? But that we collectively have a problem. We all do it to some extent, and that we have to put mechanisms in place that make that less powerful by becoming aware of it in part, but also by using more objective standards to the extent that that's possible of performance, rather than my thoughts or my impression about how this person talks at meetings or something like that. For instance, we see that men often talk more assertively and hold the floor longer. Does that mean they're better leaders? Not necessarily. But people can take those impressions away and kind of make assumptions about qualities and character.
So
but there's not much evidence there,
Yes. So is there a way that, for example, human resource practitioners could work with women? Because you talked about the fact that women may not talk in the same kind of assertive way as men in meetings and that sort of thing. Is there coaching that can be done with women themselves to help them think about how they're coming across and how they're interacting in comparison to men?
I think there is, of course, and of taking on some qualities that are a bit more charismatic, but not yet to make women think they have to do it just like the guys do it, because we don't. We do have to hold the floor, and we can do it in a sort of a different style, but hold the floor, and
so is it being confident in that difference?
Right, that's right, that it's okay. I think women do not have to do it in the way men do it, but still, for some women, they still have to step up to it, to not to be silent. To be silent, of course, you would not be identified as a potential leader or a higher-level manager. You have to come on and do it in your way, and hold the floor, and learn a bit about using humor, about using symbols and metaphors, those kinds of things. But still, that's not making you into a male style, but it's sort of adding some features that will help you to hold the floor. And I think that coaching can be very helpful and give women confidence, just to do it also in a safe environment. And then you take it out into the more public environment. I think it's very good.
Okay, thank you. So we've thought about organisational members and the women themselves. Have you any key messages for people who are doing research or in an academic environment who are researching this kind of area, about where you think the next stage might be and the gaps in our knowledge and understanding of women in leadership?
Right. Well, there are huge gaps. Sometimes I think we're just touching the surface. So we do need to look within organizations at whether women are making a difference. We like to think they are. It's not just there for equity and gender equality, which is an important social goal, but we'd like to think that they will make the organizations better, and I think they will. But then we have to look at behavior, at goals and attitudes and values, and how they would get played out in organizations to see the process. And I think there's a long ways to go there. And then there are all these questions about like I've said, we see women are more transformational, great, and some people say, oh, so women are better leaders. That's only, because that's a bit of the message there, but I've said it's like a small difference on the average, but there's a sense in which the claim is that women are better leaders, and then some people say, oh, well, the cause of that is really the double standard. They had to be better to get there in the first place.
Yes.
But I'm not so sure that's all there is to it. Or is it that there's something more intrinsic in female socialization or even in nature that whereby women are behaving somewhat differently?
Right,
in the organizational context. So we don't know. People so readily come to this conclusion that it's just a selection bias. I say, well, it may be a selection bias, but I don't know if that's the whole story. So these become much more difficult questions. They are, kind of deeply psychological in a way about the origins of and nature of differences that we see. But it would be good to know. Yeah, there are many questions about the structure of organizations, how they might accommodate parental status better, not just motherhood. But another thing we see in the data, I didn't even mention this in the talk, is that the prejudice against women, the double standard, is much greater against mothers than just women. Mothers are distrusted, I think, because of that fear they'll value their family more than the organization, and make choices that are different from what men would make. And we do expect people to care for their families, goodness. and
who
we need
holds
to
that
accommodate
prejudice?
that. Yeah.
Is that a prejudice that's held by men and women against women
Yes,
that have fathers?
there are studies, even audit studies where they send out resumes to organizations, and that parental status one for women is a negative. They don't get the call back. For men, it's in some studies it's even a positive. A father, responsible, he has a
Stable,
family.
yes.
But then a mother, we don't know about that, and that's so unfair, particularly given so many single mothers who are, of course, necessarily valuing their careers a lot in order to provide for their child or children. And so that's very harsh. And so the way that organizations might still function very well, but allow somewhat more flexibility to accommodate people who have childcare responsibilities, men and women, is a major issue that we need to understand.
Okay, well, thank you very much for your time. If there's one positive message that perhaps you might like to finish on, are there certain things that organisations are doing that are actually helping to reduce the differences that you see between men and women in leadership?
Well, I think there's a lot of open-mindedness now in a lot of organizations, because there is public pressure, there is, complaint that women aren't rising. So I do see in a lot of organizations, the more progressive ones, yes, but an openness that we're going to try, we're going to give them a chance. And that's very important, because the women tend to do well.
Yeah.
They tend to be, on the average, quite competent. So that openness is very important to make a change and to let some women through and to encourage them, because it isn't that you just suddenly become a manager or a leader or whatever. There's a process of nurturing and suggesting that you have the potential, that which men got, and women didn't. And so they say women aren't ambitious. Well, you're not ambitious all by yourself, sitting at your desk. Your ambition has to be nurtured. And so I think there's a bit of a realization there that it has to go down the hierarchy, so that the younger women who are at the lower level, people have to indicate confidence in their ability to rise. As men, we're often mentoring men and seeing them as people who could become like them, at the higher level. And that needs to go on. And I do see mechanisms often in place in organizations where they're, in fact, doing that.
And I suppose there's responsibility for the women as well to go and seek that kind of mentorship and coaching from a very early stage of their career.
You can't just sit at your desk and wait to happen. You do need to reach out, but there is also some reaching out, I think, toward the women. So
two-way process.
Yeah, it has to be a two-way process. Yeah.
Well, thank you very much for
Okay.
your time. It was a fascinating presentation, and thank you very much for contributing to the conference.
Good. I'm very pleased to be here.